Developing a game is a complicated process, to say the very least. Even if we don't consider the need for balancing creative visions with technological constraints, or budget, or time, or any number of things, the simple fact of the matter is that the games that developers release are almost always quite different from the ones they set out to make at the beginning of development. Of course, there's always the hope of getting extended cuts for games sometime after their initial launches to get a version that comes closer to that original vision than what was released. Ghost of Tsushima and Death Stranding, for instance, are both getting a director's cut soon, and the concept of extended re-releases isn't exactly new to the industry, with franchises like Pokemon and Persona having been doing this stuff for a long time now. Here, we're going to talk about a few games that we would love to see similar treatment for. Of course, most of these, if not all, will probably never happen, but we'd sure love to be proven wrong about that. Before we go ahead, please consider subscribing to our channel. We upload new videos every single day, and your support really helps us out. With that out of the way, let's start. Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain. Probably the most obvious example, and one that jumps to mind immediately when thinking about games that would benefit massively from an extended re-release. Even in its current form, Metal Gear Solid 5 is an absolute masterpiece of stealth gameplay, but if Hideo Kojima got to release the version of the game that he originally wanted to, it would be so much better. All of Chapter 2 could be significantly improved, the open world would feel more lively, there would probably be actually good boss fights, the ending wouldn't be quite so disappointing, and those are just the large-scale changes that would probably be implemented in such an extended cut of The Phantom Pain. Deus Ex: Mankind Divided. Deus Ex: Mankind Divided is a classic example of how a great game can be let down by a disappointing ending. Excellent world building, level design, immersive sim mechanics, and progression are some of Mankind Divided's many highlights, but at the same time, issues such as its disappointingly short campaign and an ending that feels all too abrupt bring down the experience in major ways. After how good Human Revolution was, its sequel definitely needed to be held to a higher standard by its developer, which is why we'd love to see an extended version of this game. A much more fleshed out ending that simultaneously serves as a satisfying payoff and ample setup for a sequel would do wonders for Mankind Divided. Halo 2. Now, of course, when you think of abrupt endings, you think of Halo 2. An absolute gem of a game, especially in the multiplayer department, but one that had its fair share of issues. And without a doubt, the abrupt ending was the biggest one, with an entire third act of the game focusing on the Master Chief and Arbiter's arrival on Earth being removed from the game due to time constraints. Even beyond that, however, Bungie had original plans for other things, such as various new kinds of vehicles and an entire multiplayer mode that had to be scrapped in order to get the game out without any significant delays. Halo 2 is already a great game, but it's hard not to salivate at the prospect of what it could have been if it had been allowed more time in the oven. Mass Effect 3. Well, speaking of games that are let down by disappointing endings, we're more or less compelled to speak about Mass Effect 3. An excellent way to cap off one of gaming's greatest trilogies in most ways, but in other ways, a tough pill to swallow for series fans. There's very little left to say about Mass Effect 3's ending at this point, and to be fair, we already do have an extended cut that fixes several issues with it, but a more thorough reworking of that conclusion would help it shine that much more, while a hypothetical extended cut, which will of course never happen, would also be able to lend greater weight to choices made by players in the previous two games by having their consequences make a bigger impact on how Mass Effect 3's story unfolds. Mass Effect Andromeda. Okay, let's stick with Mass Effect for a while because as disappointed as fans may have been with Mass Effect 3's ending, nothing compares to how disappointed everyone was with Andromeda as a whole. It's certainly a game with some merits, but there are far too many issues here that fail to live up to the potential of a brand new Mass Effect game set in an entirely different galaxy. Reports have claimed that early on in development, BioWare wanted Mass Effect to be full of new alien species, and that making first contact with them and forging relationships and alliances with them would have been a key part of the experience, and you know what? That's exactly what we wanted from this game. that Mass Effect Andromeda would have had a much better shot at being a worthy follow-up to the original trilogy. Aliens, Colonial Marines. Given how much of a mess Aliens Colonial Marines turned out to be, we're not sure even the most drastic extended cut could fix the game. So perhaps we need an entirely new game, remade from the ground up, that for some reason is also called Aliens Colonial Marines. Of course, as many of us remember, the version of Colonial Marines that was being promised before the game launched was radically different from the one that we got, and there's no shortage of people who would give their left arm to play the latter. Significantly improved visuals, mechanics, entire levels, proper AI, and much more were things that were initially promised, and who knows, maybe with all that stuff accounted for, Colonial Marines could have been an actual good game. Resident Evil Village. Resident Evil Village is already a stellar action horror game even in the form that it currently exists in. But it's clear that Capcom had a lot of ideas for it that didn't make it to the final product that could potentially have made for an even more fascinating product. Leaks from the internal playtest during development, Capcom's own developer interviews, and earlier trailers have made it clear that there was quite a bit of content that was removed from the game, or at least scrapped before it could be included, and there's plenty of it that sounds excellent on paper at least. Just as one example, we know that Capcom had originally planned on putting Ada Wong in the game, and that, honestly, sounds like a perfect fit for Village, and we're absolutely bummed that it didn't end up happening. The Legends of Zelda: The Wind Waker. Another well-known example of a game that suffered because of a complicated development cycle, which is surprising because even as it exists right now, The Wind Waker is one of the best games ever made. Even its biggest fans, however, will tell you that the final act of the game is seriously flawed. Time constraints forced Nintendo to scrap plans for the final 2 dungeons of the game and replace them with the infamous Triforce quest, which definitely damaged the game's pacing in significant fashion. An extended cut style re-release of The Wind Waker that put those 2 dungeons back in the game to deliver a much more complete and rounded out experience would be an absolute dream scenario. Sonic the Hedgehog 2. Well, we can't speak about great games that went through troubled development cycles and not mention Sonic the Hedgehog 2. Sega may have managed to get it over the line and deliver a game that was ultimately a worthy follow-up to the original classic, but of course, that almost wasn't the case. Developers cutting content from games during development is not exactly an uncommon occurrence, but Sonic the Hedgehog 2 in particular had to cut out a lot of it. This includes the incomplete Dust Hill Zone and the fully done but inaccessible Hidden Palace. We'd be totally fine with a director's cut in the form of a remake with all the cut content restored, and that too with next-gen graphics. Final Fantasy 15. Yeah, it makes sense to sign off with this one, right? Originally announced as Final Fantasy Versus 13, this was in development hell for almost a decade. Given the game's long and troubled development cycle, it's a surprise that Final Fantasy 15 even exists, though of course it's got more than a few problems that are evidence of that troubled development. But who among us wouldn't love to see Versus 13 as it had been originally envisioned? And with that, we've reached the end of this video. Have anything to say? Let us know in the comments below. Also, we upload new videos every day on GamingBolt, so please consider subscribing as it really helps us out. Thanks for watching.